Okay, in this segment, we're going to be talking about sex education, which typically happens in adolescence in the United States. There are some states that actually introduce comprehensive or abstinence-only type of sex education younger. I'm going to be talking about the kind of sex education that is beyond the biology of puberty, and will instead be focusing on sex education that deals with, reproductive kinds of behaviors. That's my euphemism for what we're covering here. So there are two broad groupings of strategies for sex education that are implemented by public education, private education in the high school and middle school levels. One category is called comprehensive. Sometimes it'll be called abstinence plus. And then the other category is abstinence only. So I thought before we dive into this whole topic too much, I should make sure to distinguish between these two broad categories. So first thing that they have in common is that they both include a message about the value of abstaining from sex, particularly for underage children. And so during the K through 12 years, they'll emphasize abstinence as the goal. And in some abstinence programs, some of these programs will also include messages about abstinence when unmarried. So that's an interesting component of that also. Now in the comprehensive or the abstinence plus, they're going to add additional information. So for example, they will acknowledge that many teenagers will become sexually active. They'll cover contraception and condom use to help prevent unplanned pregnancies. They'll discuss abortion as a way to deal with unplanned pregnancies, and they also will talk about the value of condom use and other kind of safer sex behaviors to avoid transmission of STIs and including HIV. In the abstinence-only side, the purpose of mentioning STIs and HIV would be as reasons for abstinence. So the best way to avoid pregnancy or sexually transmitted infections would be to avoid sex altogether. And so that's the message that they would be emphasizing. Okay, now under these broad umbrellas, there actually are additional categories. So before we get into how different states have dealt with state sex education, I thought it would be interesting to talk a little bit about sort of the politics of how sex education has come to take the form that it typically takes in the U.S. In 1993, Congress passed a law that required states or school districts that were receiving federal funds to provide abstinence-only sex education. And when that was first introduced, a lot of the schools in the nation were receiving at least some federal funds. And so to make the switch to abstinence only, for some of them was very much of a budgetary concern because they needed the federal funds. But that mandate from Congress expired in 2009, so that states could decide what kind of evidence-based, training they wanted to give their students with regard to sex education. And so in fiscal year 2008, this map was produced that shows how different states have been leaving the federal program. And what you see is the states that are gray are states that weren't receiving federal funds as of 2008. And you'll see that Washington is one of the ones that was not receiving federal funds at that point. But then you'll see other states were receiving federal funds, ranging from the lowest amount was going to North Dakota, which was $66,744. And the highest amount was Texas, that was receiving $3.6 million in federal funds. And so some of these states that you will see on these maps talking about how they used abstinence-only education, they're doing it for budgetary reasons sometimes because they're mandated to do it and they're dependent on the federal funding to run their school systems. $3.6 million in Texas, that's a chunk of education budget. And so they were sort of compelled to follow that mandate. As of 2009, that mandate has elapsed, and so a lot of states have started to go different directions. Now, in this map, you can see what type of abstinence education different states mandated or discussed in their state laws. And if we start at the top with the dark blue That's where it's, they call it abstinence is stressed. I mean, most states don't use the phrase abstinence only, because most states don't do strictly abstinence, but they add, they really stress the importance of it. The gray states, including Washington in this map, and I'm going to talk about that in a second, they had laws that were called abstinence is promoted laws. And then the turquoise ones, abstinence is covered as part of a holistic, comprehensive sex education program. And then in the white states, no abstinence provision was included in the laws. So that meant that the law didn't say anything about whether abstinence needed to be covered or not. And in some states, this is a little bit misleading, because in the white states, some of the states didn't mention abstinence because they actually didn't mention sex education at all. And whereas other states described what their sex education program should look like, and didn't say anything about the necessity of abstinence or not. So some of them, it was because they literally didn't talk about sex education, and some of them, it was because they just didn't talk about abstinence in their law. That woodpecker you're hearing is my clock, so I apologize for that. All right, so I thought I'd give you a couple of examples of what different states' laws actually look like. Louisiana is a good example of one of the states that would be blue, and abstinence is stressed. And so you see that they say that the major emphasis of any sex education instruction offered in the public schools must encourage abstinence between unmarried persons. And they really emphasize that it should be the standard for all school children to abstain from sexual activity, and that that abstinence is the way to avoid unwanted pregnancy or STDs, and that they should emphasize the student's ability to control their personal behavior, and that, reasoning strategies, building self-esteem so that the person doesn't feel like they need to, have sexual activity, those kinds of things, respect for others so they don't try and, sort of force or cajole somebody else into having sex. So that's the point of their laws. I wish I could pull out the Washington law and show you what that was, but oh my gosh, Washington RCWs are so long. So instead I found this nice short Colorado example of a state that had abstinence is promoted. And they just said any curriculum and materials developed and used in teaching sexuality and human reproduction must include values and responsibility, and will give primary emphasis to abstinence by school-age children. So they have a nice, succinct law that says, we're going to promote abstinence for school-age children. The final example would be the abstinence is covered example. And the best I could find was out of Oregon. I still had to truncate it a little bit. That's what those 3 dots mean. But basically, they're going to promote abstinence for school-age youth and mutually monogamous relationships with an uninfected partner for adults as the safest and most responsible sexual behavior. However, abstinence shall not be taught to the exclusion of other material and instruction on contraceptive and disease reduction measures. Human sexuality education courses must acknowledge the value of abstinence while not devaluing or ignoring those young people who have had or are having sexual intercourse. So you can see that the emphasis in the abstinence is covered example is to not marginalize any of the students, and then to acknowledge that there are other behaviors that people may be planning to engage in, have engaged in, things like that, so that they can get the healthiest information they can. Okay, so as of the time that this chart was made, which was sometime prior to January of 2020, Washington was in the gray category. In January 2020, it moved into the turquoise category, and that was done by the legislature without a vote of the people. And so some of you may know I'm making this lecture right now in October of 2020. Some of you may be aware that this is actually something that's on the ballot this year, for the voters to advise the legislators about whether the voters want us to have moved into that covered category rather than staying in the promoted category that we had been in before. And so I kind of wish I had time to wait and see how the vote pans out before I made this lecture. But all I can say is that at the moment, we are now in the abstinence is covered category. but we may return back to the abstinence as promoted, or I don't know how it's going to work out. All right. So keeping that map in mind, I thought I would show you some statistics that people have been sort of arguing over how the statistics have come to be in this place. So you'll notice that the pregnancy rate among teenagers aged 15 to 19 in this graph had been 96.5 per 1,000 girls between the ages of 15 and 19 would become pregnant in a year back in 1973. It got up to almost 100 out of 1,000. It didn't quite reach there. I think the highest we got was like 99.7 or something like that. So we peaked out at a pretty high number, and then a very sharp and steep decline in the pregnancy rate from 1993 on. And you'll notice there's also a related decline in the abortion rate. As pregnancy rate goes down, then the abortion rate would naturally go down also. And so that by the time this graph was made in 2013, the teenage pregnancy rate was 43.4 out of 1,000 females between the ages of 15 and 19. So a lot of people have argued about what has caused this dramatic drop in the pregnancy rate. It had been climbing for the 60 years prior to 1993, and then just a sudden and abrupt decline. And so some people have said, well, it's all this, abstinence education that began coincidentally in 1993. Other people have said, yeah, I don't think that's it. And they've looked at other things. Like, for example, around 1993 is when there was a shift in the public messaging regarding how to avoid contracting HIV. Prior to that period, it was sort of discussed as if there was nothing you could do, that the only way to avoid getting HIV would be to not have sex. And they meant no sex, because they said you could get it from kissing. You could get it from, any behavior, really. They were giving the message that it was sort of contracted in this mysterious way. Nobody knew really how you could catch HIV, and therefore any kind of intimate contact of any sort was equally bad. And the use of condoms would be useless. It doesn't do anything. They really were giving this very negative message for about 6 years, from about 1986 to about 1992, this just hopeless kind of the only way to avoid catching HIV is not to have sex. And then around 1993, the messaging changed, because they finally realized that actually you can reduce your risk of contracting HIV dramatically, like 1,000-fold, by using condoms. So the messaging changed, and they started to encourage everybody to use condoms every time. And there were actually, tutorials in classrooms. Back in those days, literally, they'd have tutorials of how to put a condom on a cucumber or a carrot or something. But they were really trying to teach teenagers the proper use of condoms and things like that. And I think one of the best things about destigmatizing the use of condoms is that people started using condoms. It used to be that condoms were viewed as, something that only really promiscuous people would use. And when it became sort of normal, like everybody should be using condoms all the time to protect themselves, we have had a concomitant decline in the pregnancy rate. So it's possible that people are just actually using condoms. It's possible that the abstinence messages might have slowed some people down. Actually, the data supports that's probably not true. We do know also that teenagers have been delaying the onset of first intercourse beyond, what they used to be. So probably a lot of factors have all conspired together to produce this drop in the pregnancy rate. It's probably not due to the advent of abstinence-only education, at least entirely. I mean, that might have contributed, but we can't say that that's the main cause. So I wanted to show you the results of a study that was conducted in 2011, where they were looking at the different kinds of sex education programs that were present at the time, and correlating that with the teenage pregnancy rate. So we see here the abstinence education level could be 0, which would have been the white states in the graph that I showed you before. And so those are the states that the law didn't say anything about the need for mentioning abstinence in education. The level 1 is the abstinence is covered. Number 2 is abstinence is promoted. And 3 is basically your abstinence only. And you see most of the states are in the level 3 for one thing. So you want to be interested in that, a lot of states were in that circumstance. And what they want you to notice about this graph is that if we were to draw over it with what's called a line of best fit, it would be a line that goes up and to the right? You would see it, we see on average lower teenage pregnancy rates among the states on the left, and on average higher teenage pregnancy rates among the states on the right, and the other states are, in the middle. But it's really important to know that there has got to be a confluence of multiple factors that are contributing to these outcomes. Because, for example, let's look at Utah, which is in a level 3 abstinence education, and notice that its teenage pregnancy rate is lower than all of the level 2s, most of the level 1s, and all but one of the level 0s. So something else is going on besides what they're being taught at school, right? Like something else is governing the teenage pregnancy rate in Utah besides the abstinence only education that they're getting at school. Let's look at level 1. I'll speak of California because that's where I was born and raised, and until adulthood. And so California, I can tell you that in my childhood, California had comprehensive sex education, and it was an opt-out program where parents had to sign a paper saying they didn't want their child to take that class, and the child would have to go sit in the library while everybody else was getting sex education. So very comprehensive, a lot of peer pressure to attend it and things like that. And, that's a story from 40 years ago. California's had that comprehensive of sex education. And look how high it is on the teenage pregnancy rate. So, there's got to be something else besides purely what type of sex education a child receives at school that determines the likelihood of a teenage pregnancy. So I thought we could look at maybe some of the data that the researchers provided in this table. And what they're looking at, if you notice across the top of the table, we've got teen rates per 1,000 girls, and they define teenagers as 14 to 19 as opposed to the 15 to 19 that was on the previous data that I'd been looking at. So we got teen rates per 1,000 girls. Then we've got adjusted median household income as another possible variable. And then we've got percent of teens in the population that are white, black, or Hispanic. And so we've got basically income and race as possible other explanations. And on the top line, it says abstinence education level. You see that on that top white line. So what they're doing is correlating abstinence education level, and it's that 0, 1, 2, and 3 that we had just seen on the past slide. So abstinence education level, and then they're correlating it with the teenage pregnancy rate, the teenage abortion rate, the teenage birth rate, adjusted median household income, the percent of whites in the population, blacks in the population, and Hispanics in the population. And what you're seeing is that education level does correlate strongly. The abstinence education level does correlate strongly with pregnancies and with births. It's unrelated to abortions, which is kind of interesting. Seeing the asterisks next to it is what lets you know whether something was significant or not. So the fact that there are 2 asterisks next to the correlation coefficient for the abstinence education level and the teenage pregnancy rate lets us know that that was significant at the 0.001 level. Okay. So that gives us sort of an idea what to look at. And then the other thing to look at is whether the number is a positive number or has a negative sign in front of it. If it's a positive number, that means that a higher value on one variable is associated with a higher value on the other variables. So, for example, in the abstinence education level, a 3 is more likely to be associated with a higher number on the pregnancy variable, and a 0 is more likely to be associated with a lower number on the pregnancy ratio or rate. So that's how to sort of interpret these. And so one of the things that you'll notice is if you go across to adjusted median household income correlated with abstinence education level, you'll notice that the correlation coefficient is negative. So that means that if a household has a higher median income, it's associated with a school that is on the 0 or 1 side of the teaching method. So it's doing a more comprehensive approach, whereas the households that are below the median income, they're more likely to be associated with the the 2s or the 3s, where they're more likely to be emphasizing abstinence. So the basic thing to take away from a graph like this a table like this is to realize that there are more factors besides just the education that may determine the outcome for the teen. It's possible that, we would need to take all of these factors into consideration at the same time. What kind of education they had, their household income, and their racial membership, to really get a good picture of what factors go into the likelihood of a girl ending up pregnant during her teen years. I wanted to show you something that I think is really important. This is from another study that was conducted in 2004. And this is showing us 9th to 12th grader attitudes about who they would like to be their source of sex education. And so they broke the respondents down by 3 racial groups, Black, white, or Hispanic. And then they also broke them up into male and female respondents. And what you see is across the board, within each racial group, the preferred source of information is parents. Within the white kids, you see for the males, there's almost equal willingness to hear it from parents or from school. But among the white females, they would way prefer to hear it from their parents. Among Hispanic girls, would way prefer to hear it from their parents. From Black girls, would rather hear it from their parents. It's really super important for all of us. I told you way back at the beginning of this course, that one of the benefits of taking a class like this is that it will hopefully make you more confident to talk about these issues with, your own kids or your nieces and nephews or, kids who you might have an influence over. They would much rather hear from somebody who they know and trust than hear about it from school or other places, right? They would much rather get a reliable, trusted person who's in their life, get their views on these things. And so that's something that's really important to consider. It's easy to target sex education as the shortcoming, but a lot of times what we're looking at isn't that sex education necessarily is lacking in the schools. It's more that, kids don't hear the information as well in a school setting as they do from somebody who they care about. They might be embarrassed, and that probably, I don't have a chart to drive this idea home, but you know what? One thing I can really, really strongly encourage people to do is when they are parents, if you are a parent of a child, to have an open dialogue from the very beginning. When they're really little, call their body parts by their correct names. As they get older, have conversations about how bodies are going to change during puberty, well ahead of that, let them know what's coming. Talk to them about what's important and what isn't important, and what they should be, feeling, if they feel uncomfortable that they should tell people, and, have an open dialogue all the time. And that will almost guarantee a healthier sexual outcome for the offspring. Having that kind of information consistently delivered from parents. So I can't emphasize strongly enough that the best source of sex education is actually a child's parents or their close relatives that they trust and that they look up to. All right, let's go ahead and take a break here, and we'll come back in the next segment and we'll talk about teenagers' claims of using condoms.